ahead and get started. It's just a few minutes after 12. Thanks for joining us for another one of our Lunch and Learns. This topic today is a tender one, I think. And so I invite you to take care of yourself. I found that for me, as I was coming to join you today, just recognizing it's tender. I have a nice cup of tea here and invite you to, find a cozy spot, grab a cup of tea, take care of yourself as we have this conversation, but hopefully it will feel nurturing as you consider how to tend your grief and support your kids if you've joined the session, you're looking for information about what it means to stay connected to the person who has died, to keep parts of them alive in your lives. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're just going to jump in. Sophie is here as my co-host, and she is going to monitor the chat. So feel free to put questions in there and comments, and she can interrupt me at any point and bring those to the whole group. As you noticed when you logged in, this is a recorded session, and hopefully if you've been wanting to review some of the sessions, you've noticed that they are up on our website. This one will go up as well, again with the Q&A portion cut out of that online version. So just for your privacy, we do that, and also that there are no videos on and you come in on mute allows you to kind of have this session in private, but also preserves your privacy when we post it. I think that's it for housekeeping. There will be the Q&A at the end, and I do think we'll have time for that. So feel free to put your questions in the chat, comments in the chat, but also you can kind of hang on to them, jot them down, and bring them at the end of our conversation today. So this is the shape of our conversation, what it means to stay connected, to keep connection with the person who has died. So we're going to kind of cover these 4 areas, the things that shape the rituals of grief and mourning in our lives, this idea about continuing bonds and why it matters, how it can be helpful, and then how can we do it? So we're going to talk about some ideas around that as well. Mostly one of the things that I hope that you walk away from our session today is permission. Permission to be creative for you, for your family, and find ways that work and fit for you within your value system, within your experiences, your culture, your faith. This isn't a prescriptive conversation, do A, B, C. This, I hope, widens and opens the possibilities that you feel are there within your own life, within your kids' life. And so, again, not prescriptive, but just creative options and permission to explore how you want that to be for now, recognizing that it can change as time goes on and you continue and your family continues to grow around your grief. So I want to begin today by offering you this really beautiful, unique example of a way that one community made space for both personal and sort of a communal way of staying connected to people who had died in their community. And this, I'll just let it speak for itself. But so this will play, I'm going to play this for a few minutes. I've put some photos here so you can kind of image it as you're listening to the stories. This is an excerpt from the podcast, This American Life, about something called the wind phone.
So remember that tsunami that hit Japan 5 years ago? March 2011, giant black waves more than 30 feet tall hit Japan. A guy in a little town called Otsuchi shot this video. You can hear him yelling. All the houses are washing away. Otsuchi had been there for 100 years. In 30 minutes, it was gone, almost totally flattened. The tsunami and the earthquake that went with it killed 6 times more people than died in 9/11. Over 19,000 people. Another 2,500 are still missing. And in the aftermath, of course, families struggled to figure out how they were going to move forward without the people they loved. And in that town of Otsuchi, it led to this new I don't know, ritual is not exactly the right word for this, but it's something close to that. This thing that people invented to stay connected to the dead. One of our producers, Miki Meek, has family in Japan, and she grew up going back and forth between there and here. And she watched this documentary about this thing people are doing in Otsuchi on the Japanese news channel NHK and got permission for us to play you some excerpts. Here's Miki.
Of all the areas in Japan affected by the tsunami, Otsuchi has one of the highest numbers of missing people, 421. Today, it's still partly in ruins and partly a construction site, as they try to rebuild the town on higher ground. But a year before the tsunami happened, this guy named Itaru Sasaki, he was already dealing with a loss. His cousin had just died, and Itaru was having a hard time figuring out how to talk about it. So he did something pretty ingenious. He went out and bought an old-fashioned phone booth and stuck it in his garden. It looks like an old English-style one. It's square and painted white and has these glass window panes. Inside is a black rotary phone resting on a wood shelf. This phone connected to nowhere. It didn't work at all. But that didn't matter to Itaru. He just needed a place where he felt like he could talk to his cousin, a place where he could air out his grief. And so putting an old phone booth in his garden, which sits on this little windy hill overlooking the Pacific Ocean, it felt like a perfect solution. He's saying, because my thoughts could not be relayed over a regular phone line, I wanted them to be carried on the wind. So I named it the wind telephone, Kaze no Denwa. The idea of keeping up a relationship with the dead is not such a strange one in Japan. The line between our world and their world is thin. Lots of families keep a Buddhist altar for their dead relatives in the living room. My uncle has one for our family. There are photos on a little platform, and every day he leaves fresh fruit and rice for them, lights incense, and rings a bell. It's a way to stay in touch, to let them know that they're still a big part of our family. So after the tsunami and earthquake happened, word got out about Itaru's special wind telephone, that he was using it as another way to stay connected to the dead. Soon people started showing up randomly on his property and walking right into the phone booth. This has been going on for 5 years now. Itaru estimates that thousands of people from all over Japan have come to use his phone. A TV station asked Itaru and the people who come to use his phone if they could videotape their calls from a distance and put an audio recorder in the phone booth. They wanted to get a sense of how people are still grieving. I watched their documentary after the 5th anniversary of the tsunami back in March. That whole week, all the news programs in Japan were airing memorial programs. But I found the calls in this particular program remarkable and moving for just how simple they were. One woman from Otsuchi, named Sachiko Okawa, showed up one afternoon. She's 71 years old and lost her husband in the tsunami. She regularly brings her 2 young grandsons to the phone booth, and you can tell by how casually they talk to him on the phone. They squish into the phone booth with their grandma, wearing matching blue and black striped shirts. Sachiko starts the call by picking up the receiver and saying hello. Her oldest grandson quickly jumps in. Hi, Grandpa. How are you? I'll be in 4th grade next semester. Wasn't that fast? Daina, my younger brother, he'll be in 2nd grade next year. Then Sachiko corrects him. She says, no, Daina will be in 2nd grade this year. Not next. Yeah, this year. A lot of calls were just like this. Straightforward updates about life. The kind of quick highlights reel you might give to any family member you were catching up with on the phone. The boy, he then tells his grandpa. Grandma's fine too. I'm giving the phone to Daina now. Daina, his little brother, grabs the phone. Grandpa, I finished all my homework. Sachiko urges him to keep talking. He says, everyone is doing fine. Then he hangs up. They all say goodbye. Bye-bye. As they're walking out of the booth, Daina says, maybe Grandpa will say he heard us. In another call, a woman in a puffy winter jacket with a fur-lined hood shows up at the booth by herself. Her name is Kikue Hirano, and she's 66. She used to live in Otsuchi. but she moved away after she lost her house and her husband in the tsunami. Her husband was a deep-sea fisherman. His name was Myoji, and they used to talk and drink sake together at night. Now Kikue lives alone, about 50 miles away. But sometimes Kikue finds herself driving back to Otsuchi and to this booth. I watched her do this thing that a lot of callers seem to do. You hear Kikue actually dialing the rotary phone, saying some numbers to herself. 425744. She's dialing the phone number for her old house in Otsuchi, the last place she knew to reach her husband. Then Kikue just stands in the booth in silence, holding the phone to her ear. Sometimes she fidgets around and tilts her head up and concentrates on the ceiling, the same way I do when I want to cry, but I'm trying hard not to. It doesn't work. Kikue brushes some tears off her face. Eventually, she hangs up. She lingers in the booth a little longer, hands clasped together in front of her, staring at the phone booth floor. She walks out. One of the things that makes these calls so poignant to me is all the understated ways that people are actually saying, I love you and I miss you.
It wants to keep going. I think Sophie put the link to the full episode in the chat if you'd like to continue to listen to that. But I love how she ends that excerpt, which is this is just an example of an understated, and I'm even going to say it was unique. You know, it actually wasn't a part of, well, while Japanese tradition and culture did have a thinner line between the living and the dead, does have that more than perhaps some parts of our Western culture. This idea of the phone booth was unique. And so there are all of these ways that we can create and find to say, I love you and I miss you. And we're going to talk about why that's so valuable, can be really valuable in your own grief and also your children. One other thing I just want to acknowledge is that please feel permission to take what fits for you and leave behind what doesn't. So this is an offering, I hope from a wide lens, as I already said, but there may be things that just aren't a good fit for you. And so you gather up what fits and is nourishing and leave behind what doesn't. I just want to begin by acknowledging that our rituals, our practices of grief and mourning are shaped by, I've narrowed it down to these 5 just for the sake of slides, but they are shaped by all kinds of experiences or experiences we haven't had in our lives. And so I just want to kind of pull these out and bring them to your attention, that our own personal cultures, if you will, our own personal experiences, our family culture, religious beliefs, the culture of our faith, ethnic heritage, the practices and rituals that are part of the heritage that we've received from our ancestors, and then also our society's culture and the expectations and norms that come with that related to grief and mourning. Just want to highlight that these are interacting, right? These are shaping and reshaping each other. And Bob Niemeyer says that culture is a living organism, and it is evolving and it is changing. And I think in grief, more than probably most other situations in our lives, we become really aware of that, that they're overlapping. Sometimes they're conflicting. At times, some of these practices can provide, I wrote there, a welcome anchor. They give you a path, they give you direction in the middle of such a disorienting time, that it's comforting to know where to walk and what to do, what practices to put in place. And sometimes they are misaligned with what a family is needing or with the grappling that a child or an adult is doing on this side of loss as they renegotiate some of these things, beliefs, how to engage in their family. They're being changed by the experience. So just want to kind of acknowledge that right out of the gate. Um, and that sometimes one of my colleagues kind of gave me this image that I know if you've joined another session, we've talked about grief as putting together a puzzle and just thinking about that at times some of these pieces become bigger than others in grief. And I just chose a couple there, but they could change back to this kind of reciprocity and mutual shaping that's happening between these parts of our lives and our experience. Some become larger, some no longer fit. And that's part of, the negotiation that you have to do as you're grieving, both in those initial days and as time goes on. And so I just as you're thinking about how your own grief rituals and practices, and in this context, we're talking about staying connected to the person who has died and continuing to feel a sense of connection. These are just some questions to consider. You can screenshot this if you want, as you think about your own and also for your kids. So I think that becoming aware of these is sort of that first place. What are your beliefs and values about death, dying, and grief? And where have these come from? What parts of your experience, your cultures, your different cultures, have you gathered these from? And what might not be fitting for you anymore? And sometimes what's fitting for you isn't fitting for your child, especially in the teenage years. That is a normal time of development where there's lots of existential questions about God and about life and purpose and meaning. And so they may be coming to different conclusions than you, and they may also need some different practices to connect with their grief and their person. One of these I wanted to make sure I put on here that I've heard from so many people is it's okay to decide that you're gonna continue on with rituals and practices that will just cost you a lot to push back on, whether that's your family culture or your faith culture. If it takes a lot of energy to be reshaping these. And so that's why sometimes they're a welcome anchor. And then in other times, if they're not fitting, we have sort of a decision to make about how much we want to work on this reshaping, or what are we going to, the cost is too high if we push back. And it's just simpler and brings more ease and sometimes organization actually to the process to just continue on with the path that's set before you. So it's okay to reshape these, and it's also okay to go along with them, though they may not be that meaningful to you. I'm thinking of one teenage girl. Her when her dad died, he's Buddhist and she is not, and so some of those practices around how to interact with the dying person, and some of those really rules and restrictions, they actually didn't feel good to her, but she wanted to honor her dad. And so that was meaningful for her. And that was how she chose to do it. It wasn't necessarily a practice that she needed. And even still, going to the room in their home where there is a shrine, it's not that meaningful to her, but it takes more energy to push back on the family who finds it beautiful and meaningful. And so that's her choice right now. And that's also okay. What rituals have you found comforting? What rituals have you noticed your kids find comforting? And maybe there's new ones. And so this is one of the pieces where we can also widen our lens. If the culture that we come from, the personal faith, family, our ethnic heritage, if those are not resonating, if those aren't creating meaning, then it's okay to widen and learn from others and incorporate those into your own grief practice. And also, I want to talk a little bit about this, but are there some rituals of grief you find odd? And most parents, we're going to talk about this, who come and are concerned about some of the ways their kids are doing the remembering of their person or the connecting to their person, are disconcerting. Like they're a little bit out there. They're often very creative. And so parents sometimes can worry about that. We're going to talk about that. I have a couple of examples, but just being aware of some of these questions and how they're playing into your grief. Also, I just want to honor that there are certain backgrounds, there's some faith practices that do require you to do require people to have a bit of a structure around that. And so I'm not going into that. This is not prescriptive, but feel free, as I said, to take and leave and incorporate what fits into your own values and your own practices already. Just highlighting this, that grief requires us to reconstruct our life after loss. Grief is sort of an identity project, both for us and for our kids, where you're re-exploring who you are, your beliefs about the world, your sense of safety in the world. All of those things are sort of on the table and being reconstructed after a death. And one of those things is our relationship with the person who died. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And often it's fitting to choose some of these continuing bonds, these connecting practices that actually fit with the relationship you had with the person. And so I've talked about that in past lunch and learns, but if your person had a really dark sense of humor, that may be a practice that you're carrying forward because it links you to who they were. So that relational connection. I want to shift us over to this idea, this word continuing bonds. If you have heard of it, awesome. It's kind of a newer term. It really came about in the 90s. And I think in the field of grief, we're working to make this a little bit more accessible to grievers because, as often happens, researchers come up with these ideas and they don't necessarily touch people who are grieving. And so we want to make that connection, that integration. So I just want to offer you this idea. Continuing bonds was developed, I would say, mid-90s, in order to counter that old idea around grief that said healthy grief looks like cut off, moving on when a person dies, and to linger with that person meant there was something wrong with your grief. And as we learn more and we evolve as a society and we understand people and loss and relationships and physiology, attachment relationships, we grow our understanding of what healthy grief looks like. And so now there is this understanding that to continue the bond can actually be healthy for grieving, which I think grievers have always known. I actually don't think this is news to grief, but I'm just offering this as a permission and you're not crazy. A lot of people, when we talk about continuing bonds, it describes some of the grief practices, behaviors they're already doing that maybe they don't tell other people because it sounds, they might feel judged or a little bit crazy. I'll give you one of mine that I really hardly ever told anybody. This was an initial one right after my brother's death, but I would go to the cemetery regularly and the dirt was still fresh. And so it hadn't grown over yet. And I would just lay face down on top of that dirt, like almost to dig myself into the dirt as best I could, just to feel close. And so I had never told people that. I just thought that seems so crazy and weird and dirty. And so, yeah, this I hope just widens space for lots of the behaviors that your kids might be doing too, that you might find a little odd, a little confusing. That's why we're offering it. Just want to highlight that a way of continuing our bond is not just remembering the past, but continuing bond makes room for us to connect to our person in the present, in the experiences, the new things that we're doing, the new experiences that we're having, that they're not a part of, that we wish they could be. And the website, What's Your Grief, which is a great website, had a hashtag campaign that they put out called Would Have Loved This. So I have that there on the left side of the screen. And so when a griever came across something that their person would have loved, they would hashtag the picture, would hashtag their picture, would have loved this. And you don't have to hashtag, but this is a really beautiful practice, a way of building and nourishing, stitching together continuing bonds for your family. And so when you're experiencing something new, to bring their person into that moment, they would have loved this. Your mom would have loved this. This is what this is what mom would have said. And it doesn't have to be perfect. This isn't like about an angelic kind of construction of a person, it can be maybe how snarky they would have been about a thing, or bringing who they were into that moment. There's permission and room for that. Another piece of this that's important, and it comes from sort of a bit of a storytelling approach to grief work, and it just maintains that we all have a club in our life. And this is really good language for kids. So we all have a club in our life, and these are the people who are an important part of our world. Our school community, our family, our friends, our neighborhood, our village, our people. And that death does not end the membership of those people in our lives. That relationship still continues. It's different, right? It's there in their absence, but there is a way that relationship, that connection to them can continue. And we can find practices and rituals. As I say those words, just pay attention maybe to what happens for you in your body. Which do you prefer? Maybe there's a different word altogether. I think I intertwine practices and rituals. Rituals can be very powerful. That word, that idea, building ritual into your family, it connects us to something sort of sacred beyond us. And so it doesn't have to be religious rituals, but you can create tender, sacred rituals. And sometimes maybe they don't feel as ritualistic and they are more just a practice that feels light. And so that's why I interchange those two. But we have permission, we have room to choose practices that keep that person as part of the club of our life. So, like, last piece of this, when we acknowledge that we have a club in our life and that death does not end that, we're also saying grief is across the lifespan. It is ongoing. It's for the rest of our lives. The grief is relational. And so the continuing bonds really does allow room for us to continue to nurture and maybe alter the relationship that we had with the person who died. We can choose what we bring into the future with us about that person. We can choose the best if we want. And so can your kids. And so sometimes I do find that it's easy to correct kids' experiences or the memories that they want to bring forward about the person. And so I would encourage you not to do that they get to choose the story that they bring forward about the person, and it might be different than yours. This other piece I just wanted to highlight, you can choose to highlight your preferred stories. It just connects to that idea. You choose what you bring forward and what you release.
Incredibly well, to be honest with you. He didn't completely quash it. He batted a few. He had a few inside edges, but I think he done really well with that interview. Really well.
Do you want to mute that, Sophie? Thanks. I love the multitasking. But we talked about this if you joined us for our last session on traumatic grief. I did just want to highlight this, that here today we're talking about how to stay connected with the person who died. And I also just want to make room for those who are watching where that's a bit more problematic. And we talked about it in our traumatic loss session a little bit, but it is also okay to relinquish and let it go. Just like in our lives, we can have problematic relationships with people, and we do put up boundaries, and we may close our life off to them. We can also do that in grief. If a relationship was problematic before a person died, it's likely to remain problematic after. Of course, maybe accessing some grief support around that may help you have an opportunity to shift that, to change that. I wanted to say another piece about this, just the cutting the ties, is that when I'm talking about continuing bond, it's not intended to be bondage. And so that's, I think, fits here. You get to choose, your kids get to choose, and they can change their mind at any time. But a severing of that tie, there is also space for that. And I would, again, it might be helpful to access some counseling support around that, but using ritual around that can also be helpful. Writing up a contract that maybe was the unspoken contract between you and that person in your relationship, that is the thing you would like to cut off from your life, and then burning it, or cutting it, or burying it, or some kind of a ritual around that can be really helpful. I wanted to give you one of my favorite examples of a continuing bond practice that one of my clients had and weirded his mom out. This is one of those ones, back to one of the beginning slides, she found so odd. It worried her a lot. Like, what is going on in him? Is he okay? And so his dad was cremated, and he created googly eyes for the urn. And he would move the urn around the house with them, including into his mom's room to sleep. And he would even take his journals and set them in front of the urn. And he said he gave his dad eyes so his dad could see what they were doing. So he could read about what was going on in his life, not unlike the phone of the wind, that there's that just that everyday interaction with the person. And if you think about, even for us as adults, but for kids, that's just often been just drastically cut off. And so it's it's not pathological, it's not problematic. It is how they are adjusting themselves to this change. And it will not go on forever. The urn does not travel around the house with them anymore. It's been 2 years. This client doesn't put his journal in front of the urn anymore. But it is still there. It does still have the eyes. And just last time I saw him, he said it might be time for it to find a new spot. And so there is that movement that will happen in its time. But I just love this story as a creative way that kids sort of access continuing bond, and sometimes in ways that parents are worried about. So I just want to tackle that for just a quick second. The why of why this matters. This piece I just spoke to, that many parents are wondering. I'm sure those of you watching either live or on the website might think of a few things that your kids have done that feel a little bit questionable, where you thought, is that healthy? And is my kid coping okay? I'm not too sure. This seems a bit weird. And so just want to make space in this conversation to say it's healthy. And down at my bottom point, there is now quite a bit of research that shows that these practices for continuing bonds that are creative and personal actually do help produce a more healthy and compassionate grief for adults and for kids. One other piece that it can be really valuable for, I think that the worry about forgetting your person, their face, their voice, their smell, I think that transcends ages. I think a lot of people are worried about that. And this can kind of help with that worry a little bit, that there is that reassurance that there is an ongoing way to stay connected. It's not the same, of course, but that there is that possibility of staying connected and accessing that sense of your person. For kids, it also can kind of make that abstract idea of the person is gone, they're in heaven, or that they are, whatever a family's belief system is around what happens after a death. It can kind of that's a very abstract concept, and kids' brains are very concrete. And so it can kind of help bring that into the concrete, bring that understanding of the person into the concrete. And also the connection is really concrete. It's an action. Let's go ahead and keep moving here. So the how, again, don't want to be super prescriptive, but want to acknowledge that as in everything that we've talked about in our sessions, you're going to follow your child's lead. I have come across sometimes where parents are really eager to create these continuing bonds, but it actually isn't what a young person's needing at that time. And so I think just staying attuned, checking in, paying attention, thinking of a family who created a little bit of an altar, trying to make that abstract concrete for their young son. And every night they would say goodnight to the sister who had died, and tell her about their day. This really beautiful practice, this beautiful ritual of continuing bonds. And there came a time where he needed to shift that, and that was really hard for them. And so this is, again, different needs in families, but just paying attention and follow your child's lead as to what they're needing. So I just threw up some ideas. You can be really creative. My googly-eyed urn, I've asked that young man for permission to tell that story, and he said yes. So love that example. I have had more than one kid, and maybe yours too as you're sitting there, who has created a life-size paper doll version of their person and put it in a spot in the house, put it in a recliner, put it at the table. Sometimes kids like to set a place for the person at the table. These are just ideas, and your family can come up with its own. Another way of continuing that bond can be experiencing their presence, and for kids, sometimes that's in dreams. And so honoring that, acknowledging that. If the sense around that isn't comforting, then you may want to, that might be a time to support your child, and what do they need to feel safe in those moments. But also you may want to reach out and connect with us, and we can support you in that as well. But experiencing their presence, whether you're doing something that they love to do and you feel them nearby, or it's through dreams or other practices. Linking objects for kids is a big one. I think that's a common question we all ask when a family comes to see us is, does your child have any items that belong to their person, that are significant to them, that link them to them? And I've just heard all manner of creative things that are so cool. And all that matters is that it's special to them about their person. At times, those might not be available. And so you can make an effort to create one, create a linking object, and kind of infuse it through some kind of an experience or a story about their person. You can infuse that object with the meaning that they need to connect. I often think this one is really basic, like, of course, linking objects, but I'm going to tell you, in my own life of grief, I don't know why, but we didn't save things. There wasn't a lot of saving. I think sometimes there's so much going on. It's not a thought. Or at other times you don't have access to the home, or you don't have access to these things, or there's been a tragedy around personal belongings that they're not available. And so again, you can be creative, you can create them, you can ask other people for them. Texting and writing to the person. I shared about how my young guy would show his dad his journals, but a lot of teens in particular will still text their person. And they'll often say, like, I know that they're never going to text me back, but it feels good. It feels good to be sharing my life with them. Just back to that kind of that idea of the wind phone, just the everyday things. They don't have to be these monumental pieces like, hey, I passed that test, or I've decided I'm going to go into engineering. I think you'd be proud of me. Talking with your kids about this next place, this idea of where their person is, and your family again will have its own values and beliefs around what this looks like, and they can be wide. But just having that conversation, kids need to know concretely, where is my person? And I've heard all the things that all the ideas out there. And I know that sometimes if your belief system lacks a spiritual understanding or a religious understanding, it can feel like you have something less to offer your child. And I've never seen that to be true. You can offer to your young person the sort of logical, rational understanding of what happens after a person has died with their body, that if you want to kind of bump back to one of our earlier sessions about how to talk with kids about that, and then help them find some meaning about how they continue to connect with their person through some of these practices, through other things your family has already done. Another fun example is for to go to places where you have old photos with the person. I've seen this be really cool. So there's an old photo of the person or with the person in those places, and then you go back and you revisit and you take another picture. Obviously the person is not in that picture. And then you or your child, or you guys do it as a family, you write a letter to your person about that trip there and memories that you had, and you describe it. So that can be really cool too. The last thing I just want to offer is these remembering conversations, and my hyphen isn't accidental there, but it's about regathering memories, parts of this person back into you, into your life, and into your story. And so I'm going to give you a couple examples of that. If you're watching on a phone, this is likely so tiny you can't see it, but if you're watching on a computer, feel free to screenshot this. These are really beautiful questions that come from StoryCorps, that has a lovely conversation project around relationships and also grief. And so these are you could pick some questions out of here to have with your young person. Um, there's some other ones that I love to use, which are to bring the person's voice into now for them. So sometimes if young person or even an adult is having trouble making a decision about something, I might say, I wonder what your dad would say in this situation. Like if he was here, if he could pop in just for a minute, because we know our people, they're wired into us, like we're connected. And so usually we have a sense of how they would respond and how they might support us. Um, yeah. So we're coming to a close here and we're going to have room for our Q&A. If you have some questions today, and it might be about today, it might be about something else you've been thinking about for your kids in grief. But I just wanted to take this image and just remind you that it can look any which way and that it is normal and is healthy. And it's an important valuable part of making space for compassionate grief, both for you and for your child. I'm going to close us out with one last little piece here, a 1-minute clip of a conversation that I had with Robert Niemeyer, who's sort of a well known in the world of grief. And I was going to just share with you what he shared with me. And then I thought about continuing bonds. And I thought, no, let's let him tell you in his own voice. And I want to acknowledge, kind of circling back to where we started, about all of the things that come and are shaping our practices and rituals of grief. They will change over time for your kids, for you. And there is so much room for that. So as you listen to this really brief response that Bob offers me, 20 years next year is the anniversary of my brother's death. And I continue to, navigate, reshape the relationship and the way that it shows up in my life and the way that my life has grown large around my loss. And so I'm going to let Bob offer these beautiful words instead of just sharing what he shared. One of the questions that I'm pondering right now is, in my hope that my brother lives on in my life, is it possible that I've made my life like his legacy versus my own? And how do I hold these two tensions?
Yeah.
Does that make sense what I'm...
Well, it does. It's a really deep question. And maybe the two are intricately interwoven to a point that you can't easily tease them apart. This kind of genetic and affective and historical bond that you and Ryan share may be the most viable thing is not to think of, okay, how do I start my life as another strand rather than a continuation of this one that's woven together with his, but maybe it's, how do I embellish this? How do I, continue the embroidery? How do I make of this a pattern that carries a stamp of creativity and individuality? But that doesn't mean I have to snip the line of connection in order to do that. We are all outgrowths of something. It's mainly a question of whether or not we acknowledge that.
So I think that's the invitation for you, for me, for your kids, is to consider, how do you want to continue to embroider? I like that word that he used. The relationship with this person in your life going forward. You can snip the line if continuing that is not what you want. But for a lot of people, we're trying to figure out how to reshape our relationship with the person, to continue embroidering their impact on us. as we go around our grief and keep moving forward in our lives. So I think that's it for me. So we'll move on to the Q&A.